Hi, I'm Colleen Carroll Campbell, host of Faith and Culture. Today I'm on the grounds of St. Joseph's Seminary in New York to talk with Dr. William Thierfelder about the proper role of athletics in the Christian life. Please stay tuned. Welcome to Faith and Culture. I'm your host, Colleen Carroll Campbell, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. William Thierfelder. Bill is a sports psychologist, and he's the president of Belmont Abbey College in North Carolina. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thanks, Colleen. I appreciate being on the show.
Well, I'm so glad to have you. And this topic, virtue in sports and the proper role of athletics in the Christian life, I think is really interesting, and one in which you've really taken the lead. And you don't often hear, unfortunately, people even discuing some of these issues.
I wish we heard more.
Yeah. Well, that's why you're here. So, so we're going to have you give us the full, scope for this. But first, I want you to tell our viewers just a little bit about your background in sports. You were an Olympian, a two-time Division I All-American. Tell us a little bit. And your father was in athletics?
Well, we're back in New York, and actually, as you pointed out, filming up here, long ago, my dad was actually a seminarian here. So this is really coming full circle.
Wow.
And I grew up in New York, and part of being in the Bronx was my dad was vice president of the New York Yankees, back when CBS owned them. And then my own background, as you pointed out, I was very fortunate to be able to compete at a good level, and I was also a Division I coach.
Oh, and tell us what sport I can.
Track and field.
Okay.
I use the height for something good. People might not be able to tell, but it's 6'8". You know,
I might have speculated basketball.
That's what everybody speculates, I think. So, but I enjoyed it. I had a great time. Got to compete, in Europe and so forth, and it just was a wonderful experience. And my doctorate's in sports psych and human movement, and a lot of my work has been in sport all of my life. And to end up at Belmont Abbey College was really a call. It was so, you couldn't track me. You know, how the heck did you get there? But it was a real call for my wife and I and our family. And I don't know if you know, we have 10 children.
I saw that. That's pretty impressive. You've got your own team right there.
We did, yes. Yeah.
You probably get a lot of those comments, don't you?
We do.
Yeah, well, that's great. And you were also a Division I coach, is that right?
I was up at Boston University, and was very fortunate. I was with some great people. Dave Hemry, who was an Olympic gold medalist and world record holder. Wow. Joan Benoit, now Samuelson, who was a world record holder in the marathon, 84 Olympic gold medalist in the marathon. Wow. John Thomas, who was a silver medalist in the 1960 Olympic Games in the high jump. So just remarkable group of people that I got to be mentored by and trained and taught myself. So
and what was your event?
I was high jump. Okay. I was actually a straddle high jumper, and most people probably aren't going to know what a straddle high jumper is, but it's the one who rolls face down over the bar as opposed to all the ones that go over backwards now.
Oh.
So when I was competing, I competed against people like Dwight Stones. People might remember those names. See, I'm getting so old now with the white beard, you know. I can't even remember high jumping anymore. But I was, again, very fortunate and got to be in some really nice competitions in, Madison Square Garden here in New York and other places. So it was really wonderful. It was a great experience.
Wow. And you also had some experience in representation in that realm, right? Were you executive director of an agency that represents athletes?
I often say God uses the most inadequate instruments to accomplish His will, so there'll be no mistaking His will. And so He has put me in such places that people have to say, He has no business being in there. How did He get there? That way they'll attribute all the good to the right place. They'll never attribute it to me. But I, in the early 90s, co-founded a physical therapy sports medicine corporation. Late 90s, sold it to a company called NovaCare. I stayed on as their national director of sports science. And then from there, I thought I was going to go back to working with pro athletes, which is mostly what I had been doing. And I was approached then to run a sports representation company, and no, I'm not a lawyer. So I couldn't even figure out why they were asking me to do this. But I found that I really had a difficult time finding agents that were ethical agents who would do the right thing. And I was beginning to think, I don't think I want to be in this. And at that point, I was approached to run actually a international manufacturer of health and fitness equipment. And that's where I was before I got the call to go to Belmont Abbey.
Wow, so you've had quite a career. And this interest in sport and virtue, two things, unfortunately, in this culture that don't often go together. How did this come about? Was it partly through your experiences with that agency, or just as an athlete yourself?
I think I was very fortunate. My mom and dad, brought us up with a very strong faith. my dad probably bought every tan book there was and gave it to us to read. So, you know, you read the lives of the saints and so forth. And so I think it's like anything in life, your spiritual development is something just like, you know, strength training for the soul. You could almost think of it. You know, you're building it over time. And so when you're in college, it may not be as strong as it gets a little later and a little later. And so it moves along, and as you do, you start to realize what is the foundational truths in life and what are we supposed to be trying to do. And I came to see those as time went on. And so most of the athletes that I worked with, especially, I've worked with just about every pro sport. The last 15 years before coming to Belmont Abbey, I was working mostly with NFL players. And in doing that, what you came to see is that it was really about the full development of the person. It was body, mind, and spirit, and they weren't all separate. And one of the things I guess I would just make this point to you is that sometimes when people hear sport and virtue in the same sentence or phrase, they're thinking it's a choice between either being a world-class athlete or being a virtuous kind of goody two-shoes over here. They go together. They're not mutually exclusive. And so can I jump to one thing here? I gave a talk to NFL Players Association one year. And I said to them, raise your hand if you've been trying to develop the intellectual virtue of art. They all looked at me like I was out of my mind. You know, they're all kind of just blankly staring at me. And I said, how many of you are trying to perfect yourselves as football players? Whole room raises their hand. I said, that's the intellectual virtue of art. It's the right method of external production. If you're trying to perfect whatever it is that you're doing, because we know where all good comes from, that's that virtue, but it's only one of them. And we're called to perfect all of the virtues. So world-class performance is a virtue. It's one virtue. We want all the other virtues that go with it because they don't work in isolation.
But isn't there a sense often among athletes that that will distract me? I need to be single-minded. And then what I do off the field is, frankly, you know, my business. And even on the field, virtue doesn't need to enter into it.
Well, you know, think of it this way. All of time is present to God. He has no past. He has no future. So to the degree we remain in the present moment is the degree that we remain in perfect union with Him. If we ruminate about the past, we've left Him. If we're anxious about the future, we've left Him. Now you might think, what does that have to do with sport? Well, you just actually described it. To be a world-class athlete and perform at the very highest level, you are completely absorbed in the present moment, in what you're doing. And that present moment in sport, while you're competing, is actually union with God. And if you think about look at the past Olympics, this Olympics that just went by here, there was a David Rhodesia, I don't know if anybody saw it, the 800 meters. He broke the world record. Now, people can think of God when they see a beautiful cathedral, or they see artwork, or they see a ballet. All those things, you know, have us look up and think, you know, God, you know, the creation and so forth. When you see someone like David Rhodesia run the world record, 1 minute and 40 seconds for 800 meters, I am serious. It makes you think of God, because you look at that body, that human body that God made in His image and likeness, moving around that track. It's beauty. It raises up our view and has us reflect on God. And it's still sport. It's not separate from it. We're not going to go do that afterwards. So now, is your focus of your work and that what you've been thinking about, is it on athletes per se? Is it on those of us who are more spectators, at least in the professional level? It's on all of us. You know, it's on all of us, because one of the things that also people have separated in our culture is sport from play. Play. Every human being has always done play. Going back as far as you can ever imagine, every single person, even if you think they might not have been, they played, and they probably still do. So what is this thing about play? Like, why do we all have it? There must be something to it. God didn't make a mistake and say, well, everybody just wants to play and I don't have anything to do with that. He wired us to play for a reason. And Aristotle actually refers to it and says play is much like contemplation, because it's for its own end. There is no means to any end. It's like contemplation of wisdom. And so play has its purpose, and sport is one form of play. So as long as that's what we're doing in sport, it's great. It's fantastic. And everybody does it. As a matter of fact, think of how wired we are for it. We actually sit around and watch it. I mean, you know, if we can't play it, we're going to at least watch it. And so we're drawn into sport. We want to be part of it. You know, it's built into us. But what we've done now, Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski had written a book, All You Who Labor. He actually had been a mentor to John Paul II before he became Pope. And in there he talks about work, because work is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. However, if it's selfish, if it's inwardly, you know, and production or consumption oriented only, it's a very bad thing, because it distracts us from God. In some ways, sport has now moved in that direction. In other words, it's become more of this kind of consumption, production kind of thing, where, again, now the means justifies we can do whatever we have to do in order to get the win.
And this
that's
is
the problem.
because of the commercialization of it, or would you say this even in the Little League? I mean, is this something that's a problem everywhere?
Oh,
what's an example of that?
My son, he was, this is going back in 5th grade. We were in this little Catholic parish. The school was so small that if you were a boy and could walk and talk and breathe, you were on the basketball team, because there was only about 7 of them.
Right.
And I remember one time I was over there, and his team is there, and they hadn't won a game in 5 years, okay? And this other team marches in, Catholic school, 14 of them, bags, wristbands, everything's matching. They got 3 coaches, and I'm looking, I'm thinking, okay. Now our guys are taking layups, and balls are ricocheting off the rim, and they're flying out into the stands. This other team is doing a weave drill, you know? I mean, you know, balls are going out. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be something to behold. Now, long story short, 2 minutes to go in the game, my son's team is losing by 32 points. The coach on the other side stands up and yells, "Press, press." Now, if anybody doesn't know sport, press in basketball means we are not even going to let this other team get the ball out of bounds. So, of course, what happens when they press? They steal the ball and they score another point. So now they're winning by 34 points. But here was the most disconcerting part to me. I'm sitting there and I don't even, maybe I'm a bad dad. I don't get up to the cheering stuff. I just watch, I take it in, I let them play. They're just playing. Yeah. The other parents are jumping up, screaming, "Yeah!" And I'm thinking, I'm like in the Twilight Zone. What are these people doing?
So the parents from the other side are encouraging
they're
their
cheering
kids to
when
run
they
up
press
to
and they
score.
steal the ball and they're up to 34 points, and they're like cheering them on. And I'm thinking, what is wrong? I mean, there's something terribly wrong. And so we really need to reclaim the game. We need to take it back and make it what it was meant to be. And it doesn't mean it was ever perfect. It just means that it needs to become more focused on the development of the virtues, which is where we're not now. And that means whether you're a fan, because even fans have adopted a work mentality to watching.
And what would be an example of that?
Look at our expectations of athletes now. It's like, well, you're paid a lot of money. You're going to go win, and if you don't, you're a bum. Get out of here. We'll get somebody else take your place. I mean, you're to be used up. You're like a product or a piece of material to be thrown around. And, sort of a misnomer is that when we say, for example, an NFL player, they're not players, they're workers.
Yeah.
So we need to think of things a little bit differently. They're workers. We're not. And so when we watch them, though, and because of technology, and you said media and so forth, we get to see every detail of every athlete, like what they're doing, and we're studying workers. And so we expect workers to work, and then we start to adopt a mentality that we want our workers to get to the end that we want, which is a national championship or a world championship or whatever else it might be.
We have to run to a break right now, but when we come back, we'll talk more about sport and virtue. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to Faith and Culture. I'm your host, Colleen Carroll Campbell, and I'm in New York today talking with Dr. William Thierfelder about sport and virtue. Bill, before the break, you gave us a good sense of some of the issues at play here. And
no pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. And we're talking today, of course, about what is the proper role of athletics and sport in a Christian's life. I think for a lot of folks watching and just in general in our culture, this question is most pressing in regard to their children. Yeah. And we see that children's athletics is just, it's big business in some ways these days. It's high intensity.
That's an understatement, by the way. I mean, it is hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think we throw billions around like it doesn't mean anything. If I asked you to count to 1 billion right now, starting now, never stopping, nonstop, and you got to think those big numbers you couldn't say in a second. Let's say 3-second average for a number. Do you know how long it would take you to count to 1 billion? 95 years.
Wow.
It's a huge number. So when we say hundreds of billions of dollars in sport, it's incredible the influence right now that sport has in our culture and on our families. And I think what's happened is that we've moved away from a parish culture. I really think sports should be parish-based for the most part. The whole idea of traveling teams and everything else when you're 3 years old and 5 years old is just, it's kind of crazy, to be honest with you.
How did that come about, and what's your take on that? I mean, why do you see that as problematic?
Well, we've gotten to this thing about, as I described earlier, of production and consumption. It's almost like we've got to accomplish these certain things so we can get to the next thing and the next thing, and somehow we think we're going to be happy when it's all over, or we're going to have a pro athlete when it's all done.
Right.
And, I'm 6'8", as I pointed out. I was never going to be a jockey. No matter how hard I trained or what I did, I'm not going to be a jockey. I'd be dragging my feet in the dirt, as I ride the horse. And likewise, I've worked with a lot of NFL players. you don't accidentally become an NFL player. I mean, there is something you've been blessed with that is really unique as a human being. And so you can start at 3 years old or 5 years old. That does not guarantee that you're going to be an NFL player, because by the time you're 18 or 19, if you don't look a certain way and have a certain body and certain attributes, you're not playing in the NFL. Right. So I think we get too caught up in the end instead of why are we even doing it? Like, what's the point to it? And it becomes very disruptive to family life. I mean, our kids go out and play. They play like I did, growing up in the Bronx. I mean, you know, we went out and played. Nobody organized it. Nobody had clipboards. We didn't have uniforms. You know, the cars were out of bounds. That wall, if you hit it, you're hurt, but that's out of bounds. You know, you're playing on sidewalk and a little bit of grass. You know, your ball went to the street, gets sucked up under a car, it's gone. You know, I mean, that's life. I mean, you just go out and play.
And what's the value of that versus something that's extremely regimented and a lot of attention, adult attention on getting it just right?
Well, again, we've made it into some kind of selfish or self-absorbed kind of work. It's not the intent of play like what it's for. And by the way, that doesn't mean we can't compete at a high level and be a world-class athlete, as I said earlier. It's just we're trying to get something. We're trying to have an end. We're trying to make it so that you're going to be somehow this, again, successful pro athlete, or you're going to get scholarships to college, or whatever it might be, is pushing people, and it's very disruptive to the family. But this is something that we need to address. And maybe some people are listening to this thing, well, you know, should we even be talking about sport? You know, is it really even that important? I would tell anybody, go back, look at what Socrates had to say, Plato, Cicero, who am I leaving out? St. Paul, St. Irenaeus, St. Athanasius, St. Benedict, St. Augustine actually wrote, when I played ball games. St. Augustine, you don't think of St. Augustine playing ball games. You know, John Henry Cardinal Newman, you know, all of these individuals, St. Francis de Sales, they all had things to say about sport. All of these people, all through time, are talking about sport. So these are the greatest minds. This is where we're saying, you know, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they're all talking about it. Yeah. Because it's an important part of who we are as human beings. And it's important for us to understand it so that we can balance it and put it in its right perspective. And then to double the talents. I've often said, if you've got the ability to be a world-class athlete, I think you have an obligation to go be one, because God gave you that talent and ability. You should want to double your talents.
Right. And so I wonder if some of the reaction that we get of then just becoming spectators is because of this sense of it's so out of whack, especially for children today, that by the time you're an adult, you know, versus you're talking about great saints and philosophers who saw this as a continuing part of life, play being a part of life. In other words, play is not something you do as a preschooler or a small child and then it's over.
That's right. And St. Francis de Sales specifically says, and he talks about, you know, it was really amazing how much he wrote about this, and at the end he says, the danger, though, is if it becomes an occupation. Now, he's not talking about somebody who does it for a job. That's fine if that's what they do. But he's saying the average person, if we now make this thing called play or this thing called sport, which can be very good and it helps us in many ways, if it becomes an occupation to us, it now has become a problem in our lives. And I have seen one of two camps, for the most part, in at least the Catholic world, but I see that, you know, across the board, all faiths. Either at one side, there's people that say, yeah, it's this terrible thing. I know there's all the cursing and everything. Yeah, okay, that's all terrible, but what are you going to do about it? And then they go and participate in it.
I mean, you hear that from parents who say, yeah, you know, we have to skip Sunday Mass because that's when the soccer game is.
Yeah,
it's
what can
too
you
bad.
do? What can you do? I wish it wasn't that way, right? And then you got the other side that says, oh, it is so bad and it's so vice-ridden, I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want to ever look at it. And at least certainly from a Catholic perspective, we can't do that. We are not called to bury ourselves.
Why not? What are we missing out when we do write off sport altogether, or we write off the need for play? Or
well, we're writing off God. You know, God made us to play. I mean, it's in Scripture. You know, we play before Him. I mean, wisdom. It's in the book of Proverbs, I believe. You know,
why does it matter to Him that we do this? I mean, why?
Because
what's your
it
sense
lifts
of what
us
it
to
gives
Him.
us?
It brings us closer to God, because again, it's like wisdom. It's contemplation of the higher things. So there's something in us that when we play, and we're not playing for any ulterior motive, we're just playing for the sense and the joy of it. That joy is an experience of foreshadowing of what we hope, the kind of joy we're going to have, you know, for the rest of our eternity, you know, with God. And so He does that in many ways. Play is just one of them, but it's an important part, because again, think of how many, you could say, you know, does everybody do everything else? Play is one of those things every single person does. It's remarkable. So we can't accept either one of those positions. We've got to reclaim the game and take this